she's a Mediterranean species, and I presented her with some dandelion leaves, as this is what she would eat in the wild alongside things like spineless cacti, grasses and fallen fruit. Forest species tend to have a higher tolerance of the sugars found in fruit, like a redfoot tortoise, so things like raspberries and strawberries would probably be best saved as a treat for a tortoise in captivity like this one here. Of course, major question with tortoises: what is the difference between a turtle and a tortoise? Well, it might be easy to say that one is a herbivore that lives on land and the other is a carnivore or an omnivore that lives in water, but as with many things, the truth is rarely so simple. Look at her feet, particularly at the front. She's walking with her toes placed on the ground, upright. So a digitigrade stance of walking, whereas a turtle would have a stance that pushes a complete flat foot on the ground. This is plantigrade. They are planting their feet on the ground. The anapsids, the groups including turtles and tortoises, split off from the rest of the reptiles towards the end of the Permian, and the first Crucellonian, Proganochelys, appeared in Triassic Germany. By this point it had already evolved a complete shell through large osteoderms and the widening of its ribs. And Pangaea being a single supercontinent, Proganochelys and its kin were able to spread across the world, hence why all of their descendants are found all over the world, and they have the common feature of this shell. Each individual piece of the shell is referred to as a scute, and the top half of the shell is called the carapace, and the under half is referred to as the plastron, which is also the name of the armoured chest piece worn by fencers. Tortoise shells are quite adaptable. Their aquatic cousins, the turtles, are clearly much more streamlined than they are, but perhaps most notably are the tortoises of the Galapagos Islands. In fact, they're so notable on the islands that the islands got the name Galapagos, which is an old Spanish word meaning tortoise. They are effectively the Tortoise Islands. When Charles Darwin visited in 1835, he was told that you could look at a tortoise's shell and tell what the environment was like on the island it came from. He took particular interest in them, and he rode on them as well. Tortoises with a peaked shell and a long neck, they were clearly adapted to an environment which had very little ground vegetation and a lot of shrubs, trees and cacti. This adaptation would allow for them to reach up and munch on the delicious vegetation that wasn't on the ground, whereas those with a domed shell were more adapted to islands where there was a lot of grass and they could reach down and simply eat off the ground. But how did giant tortoises get to the Galapagos? Charles Darwin hypothesized that they would have floated from the mainland on something like a raft of vegetation and enter some sort of state of torpor whilst floating across, but he couldn't prove it. In 2006, such an event was observed. The Aldabra Atoll lies some 850 kilometres off the coast of Tanzania and has its own population of giant tortoises. After a storm, this lone tortoise was cast away. Spending around 4 weeks at sea, the cold temperatures triggered such a state of torpor as Darwin predicted, and during this floating voyage, barnacles affixed themselves to the tortoise. Eventually reaching the coast of Tanzania, the tortoise was able to simply dry off, resulting in the barnacles dropping off, and this is the dispersal mechanism that was used by the ancestral tortoises. Despite often being keystone species, many tortoises are threatened. In the Galapagos, where they definitely are keystone species, introduced species like goats and rats have stripped away vegetation and eaten their eggs faster than they can repopulate. Other species like the Madagascan radiated tortoise are critically endangered owing to habitat being lost to farmland and the advent of traditional medicines which do not work. There are some stories of hope, with conservationists working to incentivise local farmers for not destroying such forests and habitats. And very recently, a Fernandina Island tortoise has been discovered, once thought extinct, and now there will be efforts to attempt to find mates and replenish this species that was once thought to be completely lost. However, personally, I do think that this will turn out to be like the case of Lonesome George, the Pinta Island tortoise that was famously the last of its species and died nearly 10 years ago now. In captivity, tortoises do make for popular pets. With this, however, do come some problems. One such problem is knowing what you're buying. A lot of people will buy baby sulcata tortoises without realising just how big they grow, with adults weighing in at 45 kilograms. Another problem that arises in captivity is pyramiding. This is a form of metabolic bone disease, and people don't necessarily realise that the shape of a tortoise's shell can be indicative of its health. While it's meant to be a dome shape ideally, some people think that pyramiding is natural and beneficial, whereas actually this is a sign of a lack of either calcium in the diet or ultraviolet light, and as a result of this, keratin builds up on top of the scutes. Sometimes this doesn't harm the tortoise. You'll see many tortoises in captivity with a little bit of pyramiding, but in extreme cases they begin to look like, well, a Lego brick, and these ones, they become soft to the touch. Now, with corrections in diet and care regimes, they can harden again, but the shape of the shell will be permanently affected. And if you have any questions about tortoises, keeping them and their husbandry, feel free to leave those in the comments.